Imagine the quiet hills of Kentucky in 1887, a place where the church bells rang every Sunday and neighbors smiled over white fences. But beneath the calm whispers of that countryside, there stood a mansion that no one dared approach after sunset. The Lockwood estate. Behind its closed doors, something unspeakable was happening. Rituals that blurred the line between faith and madness, desire and damnation. What the townsfolk later uncovered would scar generations and turn the Lockwood name into one of Kentucky's darkest legends. In 1887, Kentucky, the Lockwood family stood as a symbol of refinement, grace, and prestige. Their sprawling estate rested on the edge of the bluegrass hills, surrounded by acres of lush land that seemed to hum with quiet power. The townsfolk spoke of them in reverent tones, admiring their wealth and influence, yet there was always something about the Lockwoods that stirred unease. Charles Lockwood, the patriarch, was a man of commanding presence, his eyes sharp and knowing, his voice calm yet heavy with authority. His wife, Evelyn, was the embodiment of elegance, her beauty often compared to that of the grand southern roses she so carefully tended. Their gatherings attracted Kentucky's elite, politicians, landowners, and preachers, all drawn by the family's charm and hospitality. To outsiders, the Lockwoods were the very image of success, their children well-mannered, their home immaculate, their legacy unblemished. But for those who lived close enough to hear the whispers that floated from their estate at night, there was an unshakable sense that something about the family's perfection wasn't quite human. The Lockwoods had arrived in Kentucky decades earlier, bringing with them a fortune of mysterious origin. Some claimed it was old European money, inherited from distant ancestors who had served under noble houses. Others said it was cursed wealth, built upon bloodlines tainted by forbidden rituals. What was known for certain was that Charles's grandfather had emigrated from the Bavarian region of Germany under strange circumstances, leaving behind an estate that had been sealed by the authorities after rumors of sacrilegious practices. By the time Charles inherited the Kentucky property, he had already built a network of influence across the South, buying land, funding churches, and ensuring that the Lockwood name remained untouchable. He was a patron of the arts, a generous donor to the community, and yet, even his acts of charity seemed to carry an undercurrent of calculation, as though every favor he granted was part of some larger design. Evelyn Lockwood was the jewel of the family, her grace unmatched, her voice soft and persuasive, capable of calming tempers and turning suspicions aside with little more than a glance. She was known to host elaborate dinners and masquerade balls, events that became the talk of the county for weeks afterward. Guests would leave her home dazzled by the opulence, the crystal chandeliers, the velvet drapes, the faint scent of jasmine that clung to every room. But beneath that beauty was something unsettling. Servants spoke in hushed tones about rooms that no one was allowed to enter, about the strange symbols carved into the wooden panels of the study, and about the way Evelyn's eyes seemed to darken when the conversation turned toward religion. Some claimed she had books written in languages no one could decipher, books that she read by candlelight long after the house had gone to sleep. The Lockwood's charm, however, ensured that no rumor lasted long. Charles had the power to silence gossip with a mere visit, often accompanied by a smile and a generous donation. The townsfolk, grateful for his support, chose to look away. But those who worked within the mansion, the maids, the groundskeepers, the errand boys, knew there were things better left unspoken. They told of peculiar sounds echoing through the halls after midnight, of music that seemed to come from nowhere, and of laughter that carried a tone not quite human. There were nights when the air around the Lockwood estate felt thick, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Charles was a man obsessed with lineage, often speaking about the importance of purity and the continuation of his family's bloodline. He was fascinated by ancient myths, by the union of the mortal and the divine, and by what he called the pursuit of sacred pleasure. He often traveled abroad under the guise of business, returning with artifacts and relics from Europe, some of which bore strange inscriptions that none could translate. Evelyn, too, seemed changed after his journeys, her demeanor becoming distant, her gaze lingering too long on shadows. Servants claimed that upon his return from one particular voyage, the couple began conducting private gatherings deep within the mansion's cellar. These gatherings were reserved for only the most trusted guests, and no servant was ever permitted near. Though no one outside the family could prove what happened behind those closed doors, speculation grew. There were whispers of rituals borrowed from forgotten sects, of the Lockwoods using the human body as a vessel for divine contact. Those who attended the gatherings emerged pale and shaken, avoiding all mention of what transpired. Some never returned at all, vanishing quietly, their absence dismissed as travel or illness. Yet the Lockwoods remained untouched, their reputation unscathed. Charles continued to charm the church elders, attending Sunday services with the devotion of a saint, while Evelyn played the organ with haunting precision. The townspeople wanted to believe they were good, wanted to believe that their discomfort was simply envy toward those blessed with beauty and wealth. But beneath the charm and power lay an unholy hunger. The Lockwoods' obsession with perfection extended beyond wealth. It was rooted in flesh, in blood, in something that transcended human morality. They believed that through the mingling of desire and suffering, they could reach a state of divine elevation. Their ancestors had passed down texts that spoke of the body as a gateway, of the soul as currency for power, of love as both sacrifice and offering. The family's European lineage had long practiced secret rites hidden behind the mask of nobility, and now, in the quiet hills of Kentucky, those old ways had taken root once again. There was something about the Lockwood estate that seemed to draw people in, an invisible pull that made visitors linger a little too long, their curiosity overriding their fear. It wasn't simply the grandeur of the mansion or the refinement of its owners, it was something magnetic, something spiritual, as if the house itself was alive and feeding on the admiration of those who entered. The Lockwoods moved through this atmosphere like actors on a stage, their smiles precise, their words deliberate, every gesture meant to conceal what lay beneath the surface. The illusion was perfect, and the world believed it, never realizing that beneath the polished manners and southern charm, the Lockwoods were guarding a legacy of darkness that pulsed through their veins like a second heartbeat, waiting for the night to come alive again. The first signs that something strange was happening within the Lockwood mansion began subtly, whispered among servants and travelers who passed through the estate. It started with disappearances that were too conveniently forgotten. An errand boy who never returned, a maid who left without collecting her wages, a visiting merchant whose carriage was found abandoned near the woods. The Lockwoods dismissed each case with gentle words and reassuring smiles, claiming accidents, elopements, or debts unpaid. Yet the whispers grew louder, especially among those who worked close enough to hear the mansion's night sounds. There were muffled cries that rose and fell like prayers, the soft strains of music that seemed to drift from the basement, and once, on a still autumn night, a scream so piercing it echoed across the fields until the hounds began to howl. Charles Lockwood was a master of appearances. By day, he remained a figure of respect, a man of intellect and charm, known for his contributions to local schools and churches. But behind his calm demeanor, he carried a fascination that bordered on madness. He was drawn to the idea of transformation through pleasure and suffering, believing that true spiritual enlightenment could only be reached by uniting the physical with the divine in its most extreme form. He began inviting select individuals to private gatherings held within the mansion, always under the guise of exclusive philosophical salons or spiritual retreats. Those invited were men of standing, judges, merchants, and ministers, who prided themselves on curiosity and discretion. Evelyn Lockwood was the perfect accomplice, her grace masking the depth of her devotion to her husband's beliefs. Together, they created an atmosphere of mystery and allure that intoxicated those who entered their world. Their invitations promised enlightenment, the unveiling of secrets hidden from ordinary mortals. The guests arrived in their finest attire, expecting an evening of intellectual debate or perhaps harmless indulgence. What awaited them was something far more unsettling. The gatherings began innocently, with wine and discussion, but as the night deepened, the tone shifted. The Lockwoods spoke of desire as the language of the divine, of the soul's hunger for experiences that transcended moral boundaries. Their words were hypnotic, blurring lines between spirituality and depravity, until those present felt themselves drawn into something they couldn't quite understand. Servants were forbidden from entering certain rooms once the doors were shut. Yet they could hear the sounds, low chanting, rhythmic breathing, and movements that carried a strange, ceremonial pattern. The air around the mansion grew heavy during those nights, the scent of incense mingling with something metallic and earthy. Guests who left before dawn often stumbled to their carriages pale and trembling, avoiding eye contact, their once confident voices reduced to whispers. Some claimed illness and never returned, while others became fervent followers of the Lockwoods' so-called philosophy, returning again and again as though enslaved by the memory of what they had seen. There were stories of a particular room deep within the mansion's east wing, one that was never shown during the day. Servants called it the Crimson Chamber. It was said that the Lockwoods kept it locked behind an iron door, and only those chosen for the private ceremonies ever entered. The chamber was rumored to be adorned with strange symbols and lit by candles that burned with unnaturally bright flames. Some claimed to have seen figures moving through the windows late at night, their bodies marked with ash, their movements rhythmic and fevered. Whatever took place within that room was spoken of only in the vaguest of terms, always ending in a shudder and a prayer. As the months passed, the Lockwoods' influence deepened. Those who had attended their gatherings began to change. Men who were once sober and pious became withdrawn and distracted, plagued by dreams they couldn't explain. A local pastor who had been among the guests resigned his post abruptly, claiming he had seen the face of the divine and could never again stand in a pulpit. His wife later confided that he woke each night drenched in sweat, muttering about fire and wings. The Lockwoods, however, remained untouched by scandal. Their charm disarmed suspicion, and their generosity silenced inquiry. Even when a young maid named Alice vanished after a late-night errand to the wine cellar, the matter was quickly dismissed. Evelyn explained that the girl had stolen jewelry and fled. No one dared question her, though some servants swore they still heard the girl's footsteps echoing through the halls long after her disappearance. Neighbors began noticing changes around the estate. Flocks of crows gathered on the mansion's roof at dusk, their cries sharp and restless. The gardens that Evelyn once tended with pride began to wither in strange patterns, the roses turning black at the edges as if scorched by invisible fire. Travelers passing along the road at night reported seeing flickering lights from the windows and hearing faint melodies carried by the wind. It was said that one could feel the ground tremble faintly near the Lockwood property, as if something beneath the earth stirred in response to their rites. Despite the unease, curiosity continued to draw people in. The Lockwoods knew how to make vice look divine, how to transform the forbidden into a promise of transcendence. Each new guest left a little more broken, a little less human. The power the family held over those who entered their circle seemed almost supernatural, as though the rituals performed within those walls had granted them dominion over the minds and desires of others. Those who resisted were subtly destroyed, ruined reputations, sudden financial losses, mysterious accidents. No one defied the Lockwoods for long. There was one man, a journalist from Lexington, who dared to investigate. He arrived under the pretense of writing a social column, but soon found himself entangled in something beyond comprehension. He later confessed to a friend that the Lockwoods possessed a presence that unsettled him deeply. Their eyes, he said, seemed to gleam with knowledge not meant for the living. He left before the gathering concluded and fled the county, abandoning his profession altogether. He spent the rest of his life muttering about the things that men should never witness. By late 1887, the Lockwood mansion had become both a symbol of allure and dread. Outsiders still envied their wealth, but locals avoided the property after dark. The once lively estate seemed to pulse with an invisible energy, as if feeding off the fear it inspired. Horses refused to cross the gate, and dogs whined when led too close. Yet every few weeks, carriages still arrived under the cover of night, carrying guests eager to experience whatever secret the Lockwoods promised. The gatherings had grown quieter, more exclusive, and far more dangerous. Some whispered that what the family sought was no longer pleasure or power, but communion with forces beyond human understanding, that the rituals had become offerings to something unseen, something that demanded both desire and pain as its due. Clara had been in the Lockwood household for only 6 months when she began to sense that something inside that grand estate was not meant to be seen by human eyes. She was a quiet girl of 19, an orphan who had taken the position of maid out of desperation rather than choice. The Lockwoods paid well, far better than any other family in the county, but the servants' quarters were filled with an unspoken dread. The others warned her early on. Never wander the east wing after dark, never look into the mirrors in the main hall after midnight, and never, under any circumstance, enter the cellar if the doors were open. Clara thought these were just ghost stories, the kind that servants told to keep newcomers obedient. But the longer she stayed, the more she realized those warnings were not meant to frighten her. They were meant to keep her alive. At first, her duties were simple. She scrubbed floors, polished silver, and kept to herself. Evelyn Lockwood often passed her in the corridors, smiling faintly but never speaking. Charles Lockwood would occasionally glance her way, his expression unreadable, as though he were seeing something beneath her skin. The mansion itself was breathtaking, yet it carried an unease that grew heavier with each passing week. The walls seemed to hum at night, a low vibration that resonated through the floors, making it hard to sleep. Sometimes Clara would wake to the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway, though no one ever admitted to walking there. Other times she'd hear faint music drifting from behind locked doors, melodies that seemed almost human but not quite. Her curiosity began the night she was asked to deliver fresh linens to a guest room in the East Wing. The guests had arrived unexpectedly, their carriages rolling in long after sunset. From the kitchen window, she saw figures cloaked in black stepping out under the torchlight, their faces obscured by veils. When she entered the wing, the air felt different, colder somehow, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The doors were closed, the hall lined with portraits of Lockwood ancestors, their painted eyes following her with eerie precision. As she neared the last room, she heard faint voices, soft, rhythmic chanting. She froze, clutching the linens, her heart pounding. A woman's voice rose above the others, low and melodic, and Clara recognized it instantly. It was Evelyn. Unable to resist, she crept closer until she found a small crack in the doorframe. What she saw on the other side made her skin crawl. The room was dimly lit by dozens of candles, their flames swaying in unison as if moved by an unseen wind. The guests stood in a circle, their faces painted white, their hands clasped together. In the center of the room lay a figure on a table, shrouded in silk. Charles Lockwood stood over the form, holding an object that glinted in the candlelight, a dagger with a handle carved like entwined serpents. He spoke in a language Clara had never heard before, guttural and rhythmic, the words vibrating through the floor. Evelyn knelt beside the table, her hands pressed against the figure's chest, her lips moving in a whisper that sounded like prayer and curse entwined. Clara stumbled back, terrified, nearly dropping the linens. She told no one of what she had seen that night, not even the other servants. Something deep within her warned that speaking of it aloud would bring her harm. But from that moment, the mansion began to change around her. The other servants avoided her now, as if sensing she had crossed an invisible line. She began to notice small things, a faint mark etched into the wood of the doors, symbols that seemed to move when she looked at them too long. The mirrors reflected rooms that did not exist, showing flickers of movement in corners that should have been empty. Even the air seemed to pulse with strange energy, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. One stormy night, when the thunder drowned every other sound, Clara found herself drawn toward the cellar. The Lockwoods had gone away for the weekend, or so she was told, and most of the staff had been dismissed early. Only she and the cook remained. But as the rain pounded against the windows, Clara heard something below, a soft, metallic clinking, like chains shifting against stone. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, holding a candle that sputtered in the draught. The scent that rose from the darkness was sharp, metallic, mixed with something sweet that made her stomach turn. Ignoring her better judgment, she descended. The steps were damp, the air heavy and cold. When she reached the bottom, she found a long corridor that stretched beneath the mansion, lit by faint lanterns that shouldn't have been burning. Along the walls were strange carvings, symbols like those she had seen upstairs, but larger and more intricate. They seemed alive, their edges glowing faintly in the flickering light. She followed the sound of the chains until she reached a heavy door reinforced with iron. It was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and gasped, and inside was a vast chamber, far larger than the space should have allowed. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars and objects she couldn't name. In the center stood a stone altar, stained dark from years of use. Around it were remnants of candles, bones, and tattered silk. There were chains bolted to the floor and symbols drawn in what she knew wasn't paint. But what froze her completely was the figure slumped near the wall, one of the missing servants, her eyes open but glassy, her face frozen in an expression of horror. Clara stumbled backward, covering her mouth to stop a scream. Before she could flee, she heard a voice behind her, soft and calm. It was Evelyn. Her tone was gentle, almost soothing, but her eyes gleamed with something cold and inhuman. She told Clara she shouldn't be there, that curiosity could be dangerous. Then Charles appeared beside her, holding a lantern that cast long shadows across the walls. He smiled faintly, the same polite smile he used in church, and told Clara that some secrets were meant only for the chosen. She tried to run, but her body refused to move, as if the air itself had become solid. Evelyn reached out and touched her cheek, whispering words that made her vision blur. The last thing Clara remembered before the darkness swallowed her was the sound of chanting, growing louder and louder, echoing through the cellar like 1,000 voices merging into one. When she awoke, she was in her bed, her hands trembling, her memory foggy. The cook said she had fainted in the hallway, that she must have been sleepwalking. But Clara knew what she had seen was real. Her dreams became filled with shadows and faces she couldn't escape, and each morning she woke with strange marks on her arms, faint bruises shaped like hands. She realized that whatever she had witnessed beneath the mansion had marked her in some way, tied her to the darkness that pulsed through the Lockwood home, a darkness that would not let her go. When the authorities finally stepped inside the Lockwood mansion, they expected to find a crime of ordinary nature, perhaps evidence of disappearances, maybe hidden graves, or the remains of stolen wealth. What they discovered instead was something far beyond their comprehension. The house was eerily silent when they entered, the air thick with the smell of wax and something faintly metallic. Dust hung in the light that filtered through cracked windows, but the silence wasn't empty. It felt expectant, like the house itself was watching them. The investigation began after Clara's frantic escape and her half-delirious story about rituals beneath the estate. Though many dismissed her as unstable, the sheriff could not ignore the rising number of missing people connected to the Lockwoods. When the deputies pried open the iron doors leading to the cellar, a chill swept through the air, so sudden and unnatural that the lantern flames flickered violently. They descended into the dark, guided by the faint echo of dripping water and the uneasy feeling that each step took them deeper into something alive. The first room they found was lined with shelves of old books, their covers bound in cracked leather, their pages filled with symbols that none could decipher. Some of the texts were in Latin, others in an older dialect, perhaps Germanic or something even more ancient. One deputy swore the letters seemed to shift when touched, curling like worms retreating from light. Beneath the shelves were objects wrapped in silk, daggers, glass vials filled with dark fluid, and small idols carved from bone. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell became, a mixture of incense and decay. In the central chamber, they found the altar. It stood on a raised platform, surrounded by extinguished candles. The stone was stained black and red, and etched across its surface were dozens of markings that pulsed faintly in the flickering lantern light. On the walls, the investigators found symbols painted in circular patterns, intertwining into a design that resembled both a flower and a snare. One of the men, a local pastor brought to provide moral guidance during the search, fell to his knees upon seeing it and began to pray aloud, his voice trembling. The sheriff ordered the room sealed off until scholars could be brought to examine it, though none of them ever would. In the adjoining room, they found journals, dozens of them, written in Charles Lockwood's hand. The entries began innocently enough, notes on theology, philosophy, and human nature, but as the pages progressed, the words darkened. He wrote of the path of ecstasy, of reaching divine truth through the fusion of pleasure and agony. He described ceremonies where participants would abandon the self entirely, allowing the divine guest to enter them. The language grew frantic, almost fevered, as though he were documenting something that consumed him piece by piece. One passage described an event in chilling detail. Through the act of sacred suffering, the boundary weakens, and the air grows thick with voices not of this world. They promise eternity if the offering is pure. The journals also mentioned a figure referred to only as the bride, whom many believed to be Evelyn. In the writings, she was described as the chosen vessel, the one capable of bridging life and the divine through her submission to the ritual. Evelyn's own chamber provided further horror. Behind a wardrobe hidden by a false wall, the investigators discovered another staircase leading downward into a small sanctuary-like space. On one wall hung portraits, women of striking resemblance to Evelyn, dressed in attire from different eras. their eyes all painted with the same strange glint. Beneath the paintings were relics, rings, strands of hair, bits of fabric that appeared to have been taken from each woman. It was as if Evelyn had been reborn again and again through generations, her likeness carried across time like a haunting echo. On a table nearby lay a single open book, its pages covered in intricate illustrations of human figures entwined in ritualistic poses, surrounded by symbols that suggested both worship and torment. The longer the authorities stayed within the mansion, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, their breath visible in the air. One man claimed to hear whispers calling his name, another said he saw movement in the shadows. A deputy fainted after touching the altar, claiming he felt something move beneath the stone, something warm and breathing. When they tried to remove certain artifacts, the candles extinguished all at once, plunging the cellar into darkness. Panic spread, and the group fled to the surface, shaken and pale. The sheriff ordered the mansion sealed, declaring it cursed. News spread quickly through the county, and the Lockwood name became a thing of dread. Journalists descended upon the area, eager for details, but few dared to stay near the property after sundown. Those who did reported strange occurrences, windows that glowed faintly from within, though the house was abandoned, faint music drifting from the hills, and a scent of perfume carried on the wind. The Lockwoods themselves were never found. Some claimed they fled before the search, others believed they perished in the fires that consumed part of the estate shortly after the investigation began, yet no bodies were ever recovered. The journals were taken into custody, though many pages went missing soon after. Scholars who attempted to study them either fell ill or abandoned their research. One theologian, after reading only a few entries, locked himself away and refused to speak again. The sheriff who led the raid resigned from his position within a month, claiming he had seen things not meant for the eyes of men. The mansion, though partially destroyed by fire, remained standing, its blackened frame visible from the road like a monument to sin. Over time, the Lockwood estate became a local legend. People whispered that the family had never died, that they had succeeded in their quest for immortality by merging their essence with something from beyond. There were reports of figures wandering the grounds at night, pale and silent, moving with unnatural grace. Travelers who spent the night nearby often dreamed of a woman with dark eyes and a voice like velvet, whispering promises of eternal pleasure in exchange for devotion. Even the land around the mansion seemed poisoned. The grass grew unevenly, the trees twisted toward the house as if drawn by unseen gravity. Animals avoided the property entirely, and those who trespassed often fell sick soon after. What disturbed locals most were the nights when the wind shifted just right, carrying faint sounds from the ruins. It was said that if you stood near the gate long enough, you could hear chanting beneath the earth, the echo of rituals that refused to end. Some swore they saw candlelight flickering behind the cracked windows, shadows moving in patterns too deliberate to be random. Others believed the Lockwoods had become part of the mansion itself, bound forever to the place where they had sought to defy mortality, their souls trapped between the world they tried to transcend and the darkness they had awakened. The downfall of the Lockwood family came not through mortal justice, but through something far older, something that rose from the very darkness they had summoned. After the investigation ended and the estate was sealed, the mansion did not stay silent for long. The townspeople spoke of strange lights flickering behind its broken windows, of sounds that drifted across the hills, low chants, the distant echo of a woman's laughter, and cries that were neither human nor animal. The ground itself seemed to reject the house, the soil turning black around its foundations. Grass refused to grow, and the trees along the property line began to wither, their branches curling inward as though recoiling from an unseen blight. Those who lived nearby claimed to feel the change in the air, a heaviness that clung to the lungs, a taste of iron and ash that never fully left the tongue. It began with the servants who had escaped before the fire. One by one they met grim ends, fevers that consumed them overnight, accidents that defied explanation, sudden madness that drove them to wander into the woods and never return. Clara, who had tried to expose the Lockwoods, became a shell of herself. Her dreams were plagued by visions of the mansion burning, yet within the flames she saw figures dancing, their silhouettes unscathed. She spoke of Evelyn's voice calling to her, soft and sweet, promising forgiveness if she returned. Neighbors found her one morning standing near the ruins, her eyes glassy, her feet bare and bloodied from the walk. She disappeared soon after, leaving only her rosary and a torn piece of her dress snagged on the iron gate. Then came the fire that consumed what remained of the house. It started in the dead of night, with no storm or lightning to explain it. Witnesses claimed to see blue flames rising from the upper floors, spreading without smoke, burning hotter than any natural fire could. The sheriff and his men arrived too late. The heat drove them back, forcing them to watch as the mansion devoured itself. The flames twisted into shapes that seemed almost human, their forms writhing in agony and ecstasy all at once. When the fire finally died, only the stone foundations and charred skeleton of the building remained. But what chilled those who searched the ruins was the discovery that not a single bone of the Lockwoods had been found. No remains, no ashes, nothing to suggest that they had perished there. It was as if the fire had claimed their bodies but left their presence behind. In the years that followed, the land was avoided, yet never fully abandoned. Travelers who strayed too close spoke of a presence that watched from the shadows. They described a feeling of warmth on their skin, like invisible hands brushing against them, and a whispering that grew louder the longer they lingered. Some said the air around the ruins shimmered faintly, as if the world itself bent there. The few who dared to enter returned shaken, describing walls that seemed to breathe and a scent of perfume that hung thick in the air. One man claimed to see Evelyn standing at the top of a staircase that no longer existed, her dress untouched by soot, her eyes gleaming with a light that was not of this world. The Lockwood legend began to evolve, spreading beyond Kentucky, carried by drifters and storytellers. Some claimed the family had never died but had crossed into another realm during their final ritual, achieving the immortality they sought. Others believed their souls were bound to the mansion, cursed to relive their rituals for eternity. There were even those who whispered that the Lockwoods now existed as shadows, feeding on the fear and curiosity of those who dared to remember them. Every few years, someone would claim to see lights dancing among the ruins, or hear faint music carried on the wind. The melody was always the same, a slow, haunting waltz that ended in a crescendo of screams. Local children turned the estate into a place of dares. They would sneak up to the rusted gates at night, daring each other to call the Lockwoods' names aloud. It was said that if you spoke Evelyn's name 3 times, you would hear her reply, her voice soft and close to your ear. Some swore they saw movement in the windows, pale figures watching from the darkness. Farmers who lived nearby began finding strange markings in their fields, circles of scorched earth arranged in patterns too precise to be random. Animals grew restless, dogs refused to approach the area, and livestock would sometimes be found dead at the edge of the property, their bodies untouched, but their eyes wide open, as if they had seen something unbearable. As decades passed, the ruins became a place of fascination for occultists and thrill seekers. Some came in search of the Lockwood secrets, believing that the rituals once performed there held the key to forbidden power. A few even tried to reenact the ceremonies described in the surviving journals, lighting candles and chanting beneath the crumbling walls. None of those attempts ended well. Fires would ignite without warning, people would vanish, and those who returned spoke of visions, figures moving in the smoke, whispers that clawed at their minds, and the sensation of being watched from every shadow. One group of college students disappeared entirely after entering the site in 1923. All that was found later were their belongings scattered near the old altar, still damp with dew despite the heat of the season. The Lockwood name became a curse. Families who bought land near the estate suffered misfortune, failed crops, mysterious illnesses, children born with strange marks on their skin. A preacher once tried to cleanse the site, bringing with him a congregation armed with holy water and hymnals. They prayed for hours, but as dusk fell, a wind rose from the ground itself, extinguishing their candles and scattering their voices. The preacher left Kentucky that same night and was never seen again. Those who lived nearby said the mansion's ruins glowed faintly for 3 nights afterward, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Even in the modern age, when the world no longer believes in curses, the Lockwood estate remains untouched. Satellite images show the ground around it refusing to regrow, the same blackened outline visible after more than a century. On certain nights, when the moon is full and the air is still, travelers on the nearby road report seeing a grand house standing where only ruins should be, its windows alight, its doors open, as if welcoming guests once again. Those who claim to have seen it say they could hear faint music playing, a waltz carried on the wind, and laughter drifting through the night air, elegant and inviting. But none who ventured closer ever returned. The mansion, it seems, still waits, its halls echoing with the whispers of the Lockwoods, who sought eternity and found it in the most dreadful way imaginable, bound forever to the house that was their creation and their curse.